on in my ministry, I put together a stewardship sermon series, much like this one, based on the words from our reading today. While it wasn't necessarily a series aimed at rolling out a new mission statement as this one is, it nevertheless was aimed at getting at the heart of our congregation's mission at the time. And the final sermon of the series was on this very passage. In fact, after writing the sermon, I can remember thinking to myself, hey, I must say, this is one of my better attempts. I talked about how all of the words attributed to Jesus in the Gospels, that those in this passage are perhaps some of the most challenging. Phrases like, do not worry, and don't be afraid, and sell all of your possessions. I mean, they aren't just difficult to live, but seemingly impossible, and yet none of them hold a candle to one particular phrase Jesus says in this passage. Where your heart is, there your treasure will be also. I mean, just pull up your bank account and look at that pie chart that populates showing you how you spend your money. We can't argue with the numbers. It's time for us to start reprioritizing our hearts. Boom. Drop the mic. It was going to be a great stewardship campaign. Until, that is, an older gentleman pulled me aside and said, you know that's not what Jesus said, right? I replied, well, what do you mean? He responded, well, you just preached a sermon on Jesus saying, where your heart is, there your treasure will be also. But in fact, the text reads, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And there's a difference. Oh, yeah, I said. Needless to say, I didn't preach that great sermon again. And don't get me wrong, the message is still well taken. In fact, it's how we've phrased our stewardship theme. It even sounds like something Jesus would say in chapter 12 of Luke's Gospel. In fact, the very next paragraph is about keeping alert and being ready for we don't know when God will show up. I can see Jesus saying something like, it's time, the kingdom of God has drawn near. Stop going through the motions and start putting your heart into it. But alas, he does not. Instead, he says, sell your possessions and give alms. For where your treasure is, there will be your heart also. Our neighbors down the street got a guinea pig about a year ago now. Although it was against the better judgment of the mom in the household, she knew she'd be the one to end up feeding it and cleaning its cage and taking care of it. And sure enough, that's exactly what happened. And so every day at the bus stop, Marion or myself would hear about the guinea pig drama, about how that rodent had taken over the household and no one wanted to stop and take care of it, and how she's thinking about putting it up for adoption. Until one day recently, that is. Marion says they all came to the bus stop and the mom said, well, believe it or not, it's our 1-year anniversary with Sebastian today. Marion said, Sebastian? Who's Sebastian? She replied, oh, don't be silly. You know, our guinea pig, of course. You can imagine for the next several minutes all the parents at the bus stop listening with these puzzled looks on their faces about this party being planned for Sebastian and all the cute things he'd done the previous week. Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Do you see the difference? Sometimes our treasure, and our time and talent for that matter, they do follow our heart. And this is what public radio and your alma mater count on. You care about these things, so you give to them. Where your heart is, there your treasure will be also. But sometimes, especially when it comes to living our faith, we have to give and spend where we want our heart to be and allow time for our hearts to catch up. And In other words, we aren't called to only give to those things we care about. We're also called to give to those things we want to care more about. Or to say it differently, put your treasure where you want your heart to be. And if you do, says Jesus, your heart will most likely go with you there. If you want to care more about your pet guinea pig, then buy its food and clean its cage and spend more time with it. Most of the time, that darn pet's going to grow on you. But if you want to grow in your faith, well, sometimes you have to give more of yourself to God. After all, our hearts are not always in it to the degree we'd like them to be. You know, it's like the little boy who gets 2 quarters, one for Sunday school and one for an ice cream cone. Walking along the street, one of those coins slips out of his hands and falls through the grill work down into the drain. The boy raises his face up to the heavens and with genuine sorrow says, "Well, God, there goes your quarter." You see, the truth is, when it comes to living our faith, we all struggle at some time or another with a kind of spiritual arteriosclerosis. The Bible refers to it as having a hardness of heart. At times it's God's enemy who has it, like the Pharaoh in Egypt, but other times it's God's very own people, the people of Israel. The same is even true in the New Testament when the phrase is used to describe not only the scribes and the Pharisees, but also at times the disciples. Which is important to note because in the ancient world, the heart is not simply the organ that pumps the blood through the body. It's a metaphor for a person's innermost core or spiritual center. Heart is shorthand for the total person, for one's whole being or self. A pure heart is a life directed and devoted totally and unreservedly to God. A hardened heart is a life that's self-centered, impervious to spiritual things, resistant or closed off to God and what God might be doing in one's life. Sometimes our hearts just aren't in the right place. And the only way to get them there is to give to where we want our hearts eventually to be. Or at least this was the case for Carson King. Some of you may have read about or heard his story in the news this last week. Last Saturday, during the taping of College Game Day at the Iowa versus Iowa State game, King stood behind the analysts and commentators on television with a huge sign that read, "Busch Light needs replenished," along with his Venmo handle, where people could send him money electronically. When interviewed later about the idea, he said he told his mom about it, and her response was, "Oh boy, what a proud mom moment. My son's begging for beer money on national television." Well, turns out, his mom has never been more proud. You see, after receiving $1,000 almost immediately from the captivated national audience, he decided to do something different with the proceeds. And he pledged the money to the University of Iowa Stead Family Children's Hospital. Busch Beer caught wind of what he was doing, and they pledged to match whatever people gave him. Venmo stepped in and did the same. To date, King has raised almost $50,000 in 1 week. In an interview, he said, "Look, I don't want to be known as the guy who asked for free beer. I want to be the guy who's known for making a difference in the world." Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. It makes sense Jesus would say it this way, or at least it's consistent with the rest of his message. After all, feelings, unlike actions, cannot be governed by simple will. While Jesus tells us to love our neighbors and our enemies, he's not asking us to feel charitable toward them. No, he's asking us to act, to show God's love, to turn your cheek, to give to those who beg from you, to pray for your enemies, to give thanks to God, to not wait until you feel like it, but to just go ahead and do it. Which is easier said than done, I realize. while sharing God's love may be at the heart of our mission here at Sandy Springs Christian Church, that doesn't mean our hearts are always in it. Because sometimes it just feels like you have to go endure another meeting. And sometimes out of guilt you show up to worship. And sometimes strictly out of obligation you catch up on that pledge. Sometimes ministry feels more like a burden than a blessing. But then sometimes having to go to that meeting turns into getting to go to that meeting. And sometimes the guilt that got you to worship turns out to be a privilege to be in worship. And sometimes meeting your pledge turns into the most important check you write at any given time. Sometimes giving yourself away changes your heart forever. I had a youth in my previous congregation who went on a mission trip with a group to Ethiopia. They worked in an orphanage with kids who had been deserted or whose parents had died. She was 16 years old at the time. She went without her family, without friends, with a group of people she barely knew. Quite frankly, I was surprised her parents let her go. When she came back, she gave a presentation to the church about her trip, after which she fielded some questions. One congregant asked her, "You traveled halfway around the world without family and friends, to an unstable, some might say, dangerous country, to help people to whom you have no connection. Why did you go?" She simply answered, "I just thought I should." I see pictures she posts on Facebook now. One's a picture of her and her boyfriend going to homecoming. Another, a picture at her graduation. Another, at a family reunion. But most of the time when her pictures pop up in my feed, she's posting pictures of the people of Ethiopia, specifically the children. One more recently was of her and a child on her third trip to that country now in 3 years. Both of them grinning ear to ear. She didn't write any caption on the post. But down in the corner was one emoji. It was a heart. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also.